Secrets of the C-Suite, the podcast, is for anyone interested in leadership and the wins, losses, and lessons of being an executive. We are two women who have successfully navigated C-Suite roles. We are sharing our experiences and will be bringing in guests to tell their stories as well. We want to spark honest conversation and discussion, which may include swearing and lots of laughs. Join us on this adventure. Welcome to Secrets of the C-Suite, the podcast. This is our first episode, and I'm really excited to introduce my collaborator and coach and friend and many other things, Susan Sutherland, who is going to be our guest today, but she's also co-host, so I'm going to let her talk a little bit too.
Thank you, Juliet. And I would like to introduce Juliet Clothier, who is the voice and our host today. If you listen to our teaser, you know that both of us have been in the C-Suite. We have a lot of years under our belt in the best way, a lot of experience, and lots of stories to tell. And it isn't so much the stories as in the gossipy parts of the stories, although there will be some of that. It's really that we think our experiences and the experiences of the guests we plan to have on the podcast will just be really instructive and illuminating, and in some cases horrifying and funny. So the purpose today is to just shed a little light on me, and then episode 2, I will shed a little light on Juliet.
This is true.
Again, both of us have a lot to say.
I do want to start by just talking a little bit about the teaser because, the premise of this was to talk about the C-Suite and how everybody does everything for the first time. Nobody knows what they're doing. That was, to me, one of the big secrets of the C-Suite, which we've already mentioned. And I think that doing this podcast is part of that for me. So this is the next thing I've never done before, doing it for the first time. And I did not enjoy doing the teaser part. I like talking and having banter, but reading a script, very vulnerable. And it just reminded me kind of full circle about this experience of the podcast, but also the conversations that we've been having about doing things for the first time. And traditionally not been great at vulnerability and always working on that. And that's, in my work. But realize that here I go again, and I'm doing something for the first time, and it's pretty exciting. I know you already have been doing a podcast for a while, so you have the experience. But for me, I know everybody will forgive my newness to this, but I'm pretty excited at the same time.
I'm really curious. Can you say more, Juliet, about the vulnerability? Like, what do you feel vulnerable about?
Oh, I mean, just putting myself out there and saying, look at me. That's what this feels like. I grew up in a, fairly, we weren't WASPs, so we were close to WASPs, let's just say, which I don't know if we're allowed to say that anymore. But anyway, and so, you didn't put yourself out there. You were, fairly conservative, and, we didn't do a lot of that. So I'm learning that still at, my age, and I like it. It's exciting, and it gives me a lot of energy, and it also is scary at the same time. Yeah. So as I call it, my new phrase, which is not new to everybody, but new to me, is all the feels. They just keep coming.
Yeah. Well, if it's reassuring at all, I have them too. Because even though I've done a podcast, I have my own podcast, completely different sort of approach. This is the first time we're doing it together. This whole collaboration that we're doing, which is starting with the podcast, but has, at least we hope, multiple tentacles and potential directions, is new.
Right. Right.
And, what's interesting to me about this, everybody does something for the first time, is the circumstances are always different. What's coming up for me is that wonderful expression, nobody steps in the same river twice.
Right.
Because the river's going, right? So even though I've done a podcast before, I haven't done this podcast before.
Right. And
even though I'm running my business, every day I'm doing something that is new or different. either because my clients are new or because their challenges are different or because I'm just a different person in a different time doing something. So there's a nuance there that
Right.
thinking back to my C-suite years, I think was always present. I felt like I was always on the cusp of, am I doing it right? And is it okay? And am I hitting the right mark? And am I bringing my values forward in the right way? Because even though I had my job for a while and I was working in the same place and theoretically my job remained the same, there were just the environment kept shifting. The
Right.
challenges kept changing.
100%.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
I agree. I agree. With that, let's just start the interview. Here we go.
yeah, let's go. Here we
All
go. I
right.
got to
Right.
buckle up a little bit.
So I think just kind of flowing from the teaser, you described in our teaser and other places that you started as a temp admin. I think that's what you said. And so my question is, how long did it take for you to get to the C-suite? What did the path look like? So there's several questions in here. And was it bumpy? Did it feel organic? Things like that.
Yeah. So, in short, tell us how you got to where you were. I did start as a temp. I was working for, they used to have, it wasn't Kelly Girls, God forbid. There was some other sort of well-known,
Manpower. That was a good one.
it was a different one. But anyway, they placed me in one of the operations units, and I did that for about 6 months. And then someone in the HR department went on maternity leave. And she had a combo job. She was the receptionist, but she also did recruiting. And they wanted someone to take over the reception part. So I temped as the receptionist. And they liked me so much, they asked if I would be willing to work full status, which meant that I would get benefits and a salary. And of course, I was going to make slightly more money than I would as a temp. And I was sort of like, well, I was looking for a job when I got this one, why not? And I loved the environment. I really very quickly liked who I was working with and liked the organization. I was a temp for, probably, I don't know, a few months. I was a receptionist for 6 months, I think. And the rule in the company was you had to be in your position for a year before you could post into another position inside the organization. And a job came along, and it was an analytical job, low level, but still analytical. And I wanted to post for it. And of course, they gave me permission because a good rule of an organization is you don't hold people back when they're making their career move. Anyway, long story short, it took me, I'm trying to think of the years, about 14 years, I think, to get into the C-suite. It was not linear. I posted for 5 or 6 different jobs and then was appointed to what I call the junior officer level. And that was 3 levels away from the official C-suite. So, yeah, it was, my philosophy has always been, and was even once I was in the C-suite, although it was fraught with some other considerations, what's interesting to me? What's calling to me? And if there was an opportunity or a job or something that looked more interesting than what I was doing and that I could learn new things, then I was interested. So a lot of my early career was doing jobs that I didn't know how to do because what did I have to lose? I got to learn something and it was fun and it was interesting. And if there was additional pay, and for me, the really big one is additional vacation time, that really made a difference. I can remember the first job I had where if I had been in the job longer, I could get 3 weeks over 2. And I said, yeah, I really want that 3 weeks if you want to hire me. So long story short, not at all linear. I considered myself an opportunistic career manager, which was wherever there was an opportunity that sparked, I wanted to learn more about it and possibly pursue it. So I didn't have an end game in mind, but was really glad to get into the C-suite for a variety of reasons.
Did you have someone within the organization that was, I'm fascinated by this because I jumped around industries and, jobs over the years. And so having someone be in the same company for so long is fascinating to me. So I just wondered if you had like an internal mentor or somebody that kind of you could go to when a job posted and talk through and just somebody who understood the nuances of that organization.
Yeah, it's interesting because people have asked me this a lot, and I'm sort of embarrassed to say I never had someone high up in the organization who was my person. I had really good peers. I had someone, especially when I was going from manager to the junior officer. There was a woman who worked in HR who was just one of those really wise humans, and she was my go-to. And she would remind me of all the good things that I would do. And one of the ways she did that was to say, "Well, look at what you're replacing. Look at the mess you're stepping into." And because in
Yep.
in most cases I was stepping into a situation that was fraught or damaged, or it had a terrible audit, or the reasons why they bring someone new into a position. And she was the one who really reinforced some of the things that I could do and was meant to bring. So I considered her my primary mentor for many years, but I never had that. At least I don't think I did, which is also a whole different question. Was I not noticing that I had some angel on some other floor watching out for me, talking about me in management meetings? If that was going on, I never knew.
Okay.
Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah.
As you got into the junior officer area that you described, how did that shift your thinking about the C-suite? Because you got closer, but you weren't
Yeah.
there yet. How did that shift your thinking around it?
Well, and maybe this is a sign of youth. One of the secrets that I think is true, and I know that people were thinking this when I was in the C-suite, was I looked up the org chart and I was like, oh man, they're a bunch of bozos. And mostly I thought that. To be fair to them, there wasn't a lot of transparency in why decisions were being made. And so there was sort of this command and control, go execute this thing, with not a whole lot of what's the purpose? How are we getting people to like buy into this? It was just go do it. And so not having a rationale or a communication strategy behind some of these directions made you just sort of go, well, you haven't explained it to me. Some I could figure out, some I could put my own spin into, but I saw my job as recruiting my teams to whatever the end goal was of the productivity or the new systems change or whatever directive was going on. And if I couldn't find something, it just hampered me, and it
Right.
hampered my team. Because for me, and again, call me naive, obnoxious on the one hand, but also naive, because I was calling them bozos, but a little naive about, I really did see my job as trying to add value through the chain and taking care of my teams so that they wanted to come to work and they wanted to do a good job. And the best way for me to do that was for me to help them make sense of what they were doing, why it mattered. We used to talk about that very famous story about, somebody goes to somewhere where they're building the space shuttle, and one guy goes, oh, what are you doing there? Oh, I'm sanding a nugget, or I'm, shaving the screw that's going to go somewhere. And then one of the guys answers, what are you doing? And he says, well, I'm building the space shuttle. That the difference between the job and how you think of it is someone puts it into a perspective that is bigger and more meaningful.
So when
That
you got
guided me
to,
through a lot of years. Sorry.
yeah, no, that's great. That's a fantastic view. And so when you got to the C-suite, how much were you able to implement those things that you wished were happening when you were a junior officer?
Oh, I'm sure not as much as I thought. I think for me, the secret of the C-suite was a little bit of, they actually don't really have a plan. And therefore, I still had the same problem.
Right.
I was invited to try to help shape a plan. And there were times when we worked well as a team and the plan got shaped and things happened. But then there were other times where there was a plan, we weren't necessarily on board, and it didn't go as well as it could have because we didn't quite know why we were we were doing things, which sounds really, really odd to be in a senior vice president or executive vice president role and have the same sort of sense of not being able to move the battleship. And because the battleship in most large organizations is a big battleship, no one person can turn it. And that's probably another takeaway.
Yeah, and I think too, my experience of getting there, and I know I'll be interviewed in another episode, but I think too, you're trying to turn the ship or right the ship, and it's such a slow process. You're
Yes.
doing it an inch at a time, and it feels so defeating to have things not move in the way that you can see it. You can see, like, I can see the solution.
Mhm.
If we could all just get on the same page and move in the same direction, we can write this thing much faster than we're doing, where we're all spinning in our own spaces. So that to me really resonates, is that if people aren't connecting and communicating and understand that they're building the space shuttle, even at the C-suite level, that's where, how is anyone else going to know that in the
Yeah.
company? How are you ever going to do that? And one of my big things that I'm sure I'll bring up a lot in our podcast is, and when I do consulting with companies, is what is your North Star and how are you communicating that? Because if everybody doesn't understand that, you're never getting there. You're
Right.
just never getting there. So,
Yeah. And one of the things I want to pile on here, because one of my observations, and I know it's not a universal truth, but that once you are further up the org chart chain, you actually have more power in the organization, but you also become conscious of who at your level has more power, more influence, makes more money, has the ear of the chairman or the CEO. And it's interesting how those kinds of things can very quickly um, get infused in the teamwork and become divisive, right? Like, you think you're all peers and you think you're all working together for something, but in fact, you don't trust Joe over there because he said something about you in another meeting that you weren't in, but you heard about it. And the one person across the hall from you, who you're not sure exactly what they're doing in their job because you can't see much happening, they're making way more money than you, and you're wondering how that happened, right? So there are all kinds of dynamics that I think happen at the senior most levels of organization and with the board of directors, that isn't always very constructive or positive. And most organizations, one, very reluctant to talk about them, very reluctant to admit to any of those things. But I think they're very real. And a lot of people that I know and have worked with as a coach, are trying to figure out how to navigate, how to be successful when they don't feel like they're part of a cohesive team. And
yeah,
I think that's unfortunately, a very common thing.
I think so too. I agree with that. On that note, what makes a good leader? So, you know, we've seen a lot of bad leaders, but
Yeah.
what makes a good leader? And can you describe one that you've had that you um, try to channel?
Yeah. Oh gosh, there's sort of what's the secret sauce? So first of all, I think really good leaders are true to themselves. And by that, I don't mean that you have to show up a certain way in organizations, because that's a whole different conversation. But yeah, you kind of do. Um, it's really about believing in yourself and believing in your role as a leader, like taking that seriously. And I think you can tell when a leader is in a position and they don't really care about the parts of their job that are important, like that they are actually both leading and managing people. They're managing a team. There's a management thing that you and I haven't actually talked about as a potential topic. Like, what's the difference between management and leadership? And most people would say, well, management's the paperwork, leadership is the visionary stuff. But actually, even as a leader, you have to do a fair amount of management, because you have to try to get everybody on board, right? So there's a authenticity that's important. There is the ability and the desire to connect with individual people on the team, but also the team, and to connect with them in terms of the mission. So there's a communication, I think, is really important. Being able to describe or inspire I'm sort of thinking about, to motivate people. Well, I don't actually believe you can motivate people, but you can inspire them to find their own motivation. Like you can help people find the thing that connects them to the work.
What do
And
you
I,
think? Oh,
sorry, no, I was just going to say one other thing. And I think there's an integrity component too, which is
absolutely.
I think we're allowed to swear on this podcast. We've admitted it. You just
Yes.
can't be a dick. And
Right.
there are a lot of dicks in the executive levels.
Yes. There are a lot of dicks and a lot of levels, but
Or
we'll talk about that
assholes.
on another episode.
Yeah.
We'll have a whole series of that. And that's not a sexist term. And there can be all genders
Yeah.
can fit that bill. So I guess in your view, and you've already mentioned a little bit of this, but what are the three most important qualities a C-suite executive should have? So you've talked about a good leader, but
Yeah.
what are the other qualities? And I think part of it is kind of back to our where we started talking about in this podcast is the vulnerability piece. And I think there's something in there. So I'm forcing that as part
Yeah.
of as
You
part of
want
your
you
answer.
want
But
you want me to put that on my list.
yeah, yeah.
Well, I
Okay, well, I'll
do.
put it on my list then.
I do think that being comfortable with being uncomfortable, both from a vulnerability perspective, from a not knowing the technical answer to something, those are all things that I think a really good leader sits with and is okay with being seen in those moments.
Right. Yes,
I
definitely.
think so is it like you own your vulnerability or you're comfortable? You don't have to be comfortable. You don't even have to like it, but you have to allow it. And in a perfect sort of work environment, people have to be able to see that you don't know everything and you're okay with that.
My
And
favorite thing to do is when someone comes to me and I don't know the answer, say, I don't know, let's figure it out.
right, exactly.
I think we can figure it out together because I don't think I've had many answers to new problems that I just had. I mean, you need a team to work with you, and that's why they're there. So I think I was a little different than my experience with other C-suite folks and their ability to say they didn't know how to do something.
Right, right. So that sort of authenticity and being okay with the vulnerability or the not knowing, I think, is really important. I would absolutely say top of the list is ability and willingness to learn, and that means when you're confronted with something new, you're quick to think about the ramifications, sort of big picture thinking, but it's mirrored with I'm learning what's different and I'm learning and looking for what's where the solutions might be because this thing hasn't happened before. Back to your point of, it's the first time. And we learn from those experiences, but you have to be willing to learn from those, whether they come out well in the end or not. So learning from those experiences. And I don't know that this is a skill, but I think it is. I think it can be learned. It certainly can be polished, which is attention to the humanity of colleagues and the team. Everybody's got a backpack they bring to work, and we don't know what's in it. We don't know what their home life is like or what their personal challenges are. And I think being respectful of people, even if they're not doing a good job, to separate that piece
Absolutely.
of it. We don't treat people badly because we recognize that they're human. And I'm listening to myself and I'm going, oh, what planet are you from? That's not corporate life. That's not getting the job done. That doesn't move us to higher productivity and greater sales. But it should, I think.
I think it goes back to your point about motivation though. If you show that compassion and you're there for that person in that moment, there are people who are crisis junkies who always have something going on, and that's a whole different world. But I think people who are going through hard times in their lives, and certainly I've gone through hard times, and the best leaders I've had have allowed me to be myself in that moment at work, which is not fun, but it makes it okay to struggle and that everybody has struggles. And I think that, what you're saying about, the best qualities are having that compassion and creating that space for somebody to be able to be themselves, because they're going to show up for you a lot more strongly. Is that right? More strongly?
Mm-hmm.
A lot more strongly uh, uh, for you. Then you got them on your team. I mean, they are going to show up for you. At least that's been my experience in most cases, is that when someone really feels like they can be themselves with you, they will show up for you in a much better way. So what is the one secret you've discovered about the C-suite?
We talked about this before we started recording, and now I can't remember what my answer was. So I guess
You were talking about it being that, oh, maybe it's for you because you're not there anymore. What is the one thing that you wished you would have known while you were in the C-suite? And you were talking about losing yourself a little bit.
I wished I had known. And I think what's interesting is it's funny to have this conversation because I'm reliving certain moments and realizing when I described having that mentor in my early my junior officer, sort of junior executive years, I actually had a fair amount of self-belief in my ability to make a difference. And when I was in the C-suite, I had less of that. And I think it was the wear and tear of the role, the environment, the narcissistic sometimes boss, where I actually felt like there was a lot I could do, but didn't believe in myself enough to do it. I mean, I could even, and I'm not going to tell the stories today, maybe we'll crack them open another time. I can remember having all staff meetings and needing to roll out something that my boss wanted us to roll out. And every fiber in my body was saying, no, we can't do this. Not only can't we do it, but we're not ready to do it. This is no. And having said no once, but that not flying, then not just, being in that moment where it was so, the incongruity was so not aligned with what I thought we should be doing as an organization and who I wanted to be as a leader. And you can tell it's still vivid to me. But there were a number of times where maybe it wasn't quite that dramatic, where I didn't have the same physical reaction, where I felt like that was happening. And there is a reality about working with people and making compromise and still trying to move the organization forward. But I think somewhere in there, the amount of compromise for me was a loss in sense of what I could bring, of my specialness to the table. And I'm finding it again. And isn't that interesting? A whole new
Very.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Well, and you're in charge of the North Star. I mean, you're in your own business and you get to decide those things. And so if you did have a staff, if you did have somebody come work for you, you would try and bring all those things that you think about in good leadership. And I think, you can disagree about what the path to get to that North Star is and how you do it and how you treat people along the way, because that's certainly a big part of it, is, how you end up appearing to the rest of the company when you're in that situation where you're not being authentic. And I think part of that is that you don't have buy-in at the top. You're not buying into the North Star. You don't have a North Star. You don't know what the direction is. And I think if you know what the direction is and you can see, and the leader is saying to you, here's the step we're going to take, and it's going to be a little uncomfortable, but we need to take this step in order to get to the next thing, then you can understand it. But when it's just lying out there and it's this new initiative that, some shiny thing that the executive wants you to do, it is a really tough situation. I think another thing you tapped into that I want to say is having a narcissistic boss.
There's a topic for at least one or two episodes.
At least. So, I think it will be important for us to talk about that since we've both been in that situation more than once, and just how toxic that is,
Yeah.
how hard that is. But I
I was
want to
thinking,
switch. Oh, go ahead.
oh, I just wanted to, of course, add an extra comment to that, which is one of the things that I think is so interesting about, that there are characteristics that allow someone to excel in organizations. And sometimes those very characteristics, when they get to a position, show up in a way that's really toxic. So
Yeah.
having a big ego is kind of an important aspect to being an executive. You got to believe in yourself. But at some point, if you think you've got the only good idea, then that becomes something really different. So I've thought a lot about why is it that there seems to be there's a commonality at the very top of organizations where narcissism seems to show up, and it is perhaps because some of those traits help those people move up the org chart and be successful in certain roles. And then at the top, they have a slightly different role. So what got them there isn't what's going to make them successful there.
And narcissists don't like to be lonely. And as we've talked about, being lonely at the top,
Yeah.
is a tough place for a narcissist. So they're going to constantly be looking for ways to suck people in. So anyway, lots more on that. I want to switch a little bit. Get a couple more questions in before we close, but I want to talk about diversity, because you and I talk about this a lot. We've both been in charge of it in our companies, in our at various times, and I know that we both have passion about it. And I want to talk a little bit about where that sits in companies, and in your experience, what are the best ways and the most challenging ways to have a successful DEIB program?
Yeah, boy, that's really hard. I think I'll start with the tail end of your question first, which is I think the way to make it successful is have DIEB objectives be part of every executive's job. When you turn it over to someone to be the DIEB leader, then anybody who's not particularly interested in doing that goes, yeah, well, whatever, that's her job, right? And I will also add that in a lot of organizations, the person who ends up with those functions is not it's almost like the HR function in the old days. The old days, I used to joke, excuse my baldness here, the chick functions.
Absolutely.
You gave it to the only woman on the executive team. That's because it was a female kind of role. That has changed. HR is actually considered much more, or personnel, whatever you call it, the people work. They now have a seat at the table. It's a much more strategic function, as it should have been all along. But diversity is kind of the same thing. A lot of times, organizations who said we will have a diversity function, they give it to someone who either can't influence the peers, who doesn't sit at the table from a strategy perspective. So if human resources and DIEB aren't at the table for strategy setting, then it's decor, for lack of a better word. So I think it's really important that have the endorsement and the credibility of the topmost executive and of the senior team when that happens. I actually, and we've talked about this offline a lot, I am despairing at what I call the backlash to the diversity efforts, obviously intertwined with the summer of the George Floyd murder and Black Lives Matter. But I think it's really sad from a culture and a civics perspective. I think it makes me worry for my country, because what I've noticed, as challenging as it may be to actually listen to people who are different from you, it makes us all better. It makes the product better. It makes the work outcome better. It really does. That the diversity is the richness. And when everybody thinks the same way, guess what happens? We don't see things, we miss things, we take risks we shouldn't take. So, I guess that's all I'll say, and see where you want to go next with it.
No, I think it's the feeling threatened. I mean, certainly we're two women who have, had our own issues with diversity and being, getting the check functions and things like that. And even because I was in the nonprofit sector so long, a lot of women are leaders in the nonprofit sector because the nonprofit sector allowed for that because it evolved. It wasn't threatening to, the corporate sector. But I think where you were in the corporate world, anything, the glass ceiling was real. I think you experienced that quite a bit being the only woman in the room. And I certainly have too at times, but I think being the only woman and sometimes the only voice of reason in the room and trying to bring your ideas to the table. And you think about people who are coming from underserved communities and who have not had the same opportunities that you or I have had, right, even with the issues we've had in the workplace, and thinking about what issues, what experience could they bring, having been in that, coming from a different world than everybody else in the room, and how rich that could be. And I live in Sonoma County, California, which we have a large Hispanic population, and I think that there's so much richness there, and I know when I've been hiring, the focus on bringing people who have different experiences together and figuring out how to use everybody's talents and everybody's experience to the benefit of the organization is it's just the way it should be. And again, this is me standing on my soapbox and saying, well, it's so simple. Just do it. It's not a hard thing to do. And I think getting people to believe in it. And I think one of the things that, and we can talk about this later too, but one of the things that I came up against when I was bringing these initiatives to the C-suite is that, people think, well, we don't need it. Why do we need it? We hire people from the community, it's like, yes, but we don't give them opportunities to do anything but the entry-level jobs or the labor jobs, so if we're not giving people the opportunity, we're not hearing them.
Right.
We're just telling them where to go. We're not hearing them, and we're not using their experience to make our company better. So anyway.
So I have an observation about both of us, and I'm sure our listeners will pick up on this, is that we are in today's conversation revealing this really interesting combination of idealism and practical savvy. Like, we know how hard things can be in an organization and in the C-suite, and both of us still aspire to seeing things change and be better and be different. And that idealism, I think, is actually one of the key aspects of a really good leader. It's that desire for things to improve, whatever that means, and not just, your bank account or your title or whatever.
Yeah, those things are important, but I think I would say a level of optimism is really important.
Right.
Really important. So maybe with that, we'll just close out and say, Thank you, Susan. Thank you for joining me on our podcast.
Thank you, Juliet, for asking me really good questions and giving me the chance to remember and think out loud and connect some dots that I hadn't connected with before. I really appreciate it.
Excellent. More to come.
See you next episode.
I'll see you next episode.
We're so glad you've joined us for this episode of Secrets of the C-Suite, the podcast. We'll be back with another episode in 2 weeks. In the meantime, please tell your friends and coworkers about us, and be sure to follow, subscribe, and give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed listening. Secrets of the C-Suite is produced by Juliet Clothier, Susan Sutherland, and Brian Clothier. Original music is by Brian Clothier, and the podcast is inspired by leaders like you.